Silence isn't just an absence of words. It's a statement. It's communication in its rawest, most powerful form. And the truth is, it often speaks louder than anything you could ever say out loud. Think about it. We live in a world driven by connection. People text, call, post, like, comment, all just to feel acknowledged, to feel seen, to feel important in someone else's world. Communication is the glue that holds relationships together. It creates bonds, builds trust, and reassures people that they matter. But when silence enters the equation, everything changes. When you go silent on someone, whether intentional or not, it doesn't just create space, it creates questions. And the human brain is not built to handle unanswered questions lightly. It demands resolution, it demands understanding. And when it doesn't get it, it starts filling in the blanks on its own. Imagine a conversation that suddenly stops. Imagine a connection that once felt effortless, but now the responses are gone. The absence of words does not create peace. It creates noise. Noise in the form of doubts, in the form of assumptions, in the form of overthinking. You see, silence is never truly empty. It carries weight. And that weight gets heavier with time. If someone is used to hearing from you, used to feeling your presence, and suddenly that disappears, it doesn't just go unnoticed. It becomes the loudest thing in their mind. It lingers in their thoughts. It makes them question everything they once believed. At first, they may dismiss it. Maybe they're just busy. That's logical. That's reasonable. But logic doesn't last long when emotions start creeping in. Because silence isn't neutral, it's interpreted. And most of the time, it's interpreted in the worst possible way. Now put yourself in the other person's shoes. When someone goes silent on you, what do you feel? Confusion? Anxiety? A nagging sense that something is wrong, even if you don't know what? Maybe you replay past conversations, trying to find a clue. Maybe you start assuming things you never would have assumed before. Maybe you feel a growing sense of insecurity where confidence once existed. That's what silence does. It creates a space that begs to be filled. And more often than not, it gets filled with fear. And here's where it gets even more powerful. Silence isn't just about the words you don't say. It's about the messages you send without meaning to. Because when you go silent, whether it's to create distance, to protect yourself, or simply because life got in the way, the other person doesn't hear, I just need some time, or I've been busy. What they hear is, I don't care. They hear, you're not important enough for a response. They hear, I'm choosing not to acknowledge you. Now that may not be your intention. You may not mean to cause confusion, doubt, or pain, but silence is not defined by the person who gives it. It's defined by the person who receives it. And in their mind, your silence is screaming. It's telling them a story they never wanted to believe. A story where they're no longer valued. A story where they're left to wonder, overthink, and second guess everything. This is why silence is so dangerous. Because once the mind starts building a story around it, it's hard to undo. Once someone believes they're being ignored, dismissed, or forgotten, it becomes their reality, whether it was ever true or not. And then something shifts. They stop reaching out. They stop asking questions. They stop trying. Not because they don't care anymore, but because silence has convinced them that you don't. This is where relationships, friendships, and connections begin to break. Not with loud fights, not with dramatic exits, but with the quiet erosion of trust. Silence, left unchecked, creates distance that can become permanent. And once someone truly believes they no longer matter, it's nearly impossible to bring them back. So never underestimate the power of silence. Because while words have the ability to heal, to connect, and to bring people closer, silence has the power to destroy. And often it does so without a single word ever being spoken. The human brain is a master storyteller. It doesn't just process information, it creates meaning from it. It looks for patterns, for explanations, for connections that make sense of the world. But what happens when there is no explanation? What happens when there is a gap, an unanswered question, an unfinished conversation, a sudden change with no reason given? The mind fills the gap. And more often than not, It doesn't fill it with something positive. When someone is left without communication, without clarity, their mind doesn't just sit there in neutral waiting for an answer. It goes into overdrive. It starts searching for reasons, for explanations, for meaning in the silence. And because our brains are wired for survival, they tend to default to the worst case scenario. This isn't just some random quirk of human nature. It's a psychological survival mechanism. Our ancestors needed to assume the worst to stay alive. If something suddenly went silent in the wild, it could mean a predator was near. If a member of the group disappeared, it could signal danger. Our brains evolved to react to silence with suspicion and fear because in the past, uncertainty could mean life or death. Fast forward to today, and this same mechanism is still at work. But instead of tigers lurking in the bushes, it's unanswered texts, unreturned calls, and sudden shifts in communication. The brain still interprets silence as a threat, but now the threat isn't physical, it's emotional. And so the mind does what it has always done. It starts crafting stories. Did I say something wrong? Maybe they don't care anymore? Maybe I was never as important to them as they were to me. What if they're talking to someone else? What if I'm just being ignored? The thoughts start off small, just whispers in the back of the mind, but silence acts as fuel. The longer the uncertainty lasts, the more the mind starts reinforcing these negative beliefs. The small doubts turn into full-blown convictions. Because here's the thing, when the brain doesn't have real answers, it creates its own. And those answers are rarely based on reality. They're based on fear. They're based on past wounds. They're based on every insecurity that person has ever had. Imagine someone who has already been abandoned before. Maybe they've had friendships that faded without explanation. Maybe they've been in relationships where they were left hanging, wondering what they did wrong. When silence enters their life again, it doesn't just feel like this one moment. It feels like every painful experience they've ever had coming back to life. The mind doesn't just fill the gaps. It brings all the old wounds with it. And this is where things get even more powerful. Because once the mind builds a story, it starts looking for proof. If someone already believes they're being ignored, they'll start noticing every little thing that confirms it. A delayed reply, proof. A missed call with no call back, proof. A social media post where you seem happy while they're sitting in uncertainty, more proof. Even if none of these things were meant to send a message, the message has already been received. The brain has already decided what the silence means, and now it's only looking for evidence to back it up. This is how misunderstandings spiral out of control. This is how small gaps in communication turn into broken relationships. Because once someone believes a story about your silence, it's nearly impossible to convince them otherwise. And the most dangerous part, you may not even realize it's happening. From your perspective, maybe you were just taking space. Maybe you were just busy. Maybe silence wasn't meant to mean anything at all. But that's the thing about silence. It doesn't stay neutral. It gets interpreted, and when the mind is left to interpret in the dark, it will almost always create shadows where there are none. The human mind craves certainty. It is wired to seek patterns, predict outcomes, and create a sense of stability. Certainty provides a feeling of control, a sense of knowing what's coming next, a foundation to stand on. But when that certainty is taken away, when communication suddenly stops, when silence replaces connection, the mind is thrown into chaos. Uncertainty is one of the most uncomfortable psychological states a person can experience. It triggers anxiety, fuels overthinking, and sends the nervous system into survival mode. The body and mind are no longer at ease. They're on high alert, scanning for any sign, any clue, any tiny piece of information that can bring clarity. When someone goes silent, the first reaction is often mild confusion. Maybe they're just busy. It's a rational thought, an attempt to explain the situation without jumping to conclusion. But if the silence continues, confusion turns into doubt. Doubt turns into worry. Worry turns into fear. The mind starts asking questions it can't answer. What happened? Did I do something wrong? Are they upset with me? Did they change their mind about me? And the longer the silence lasts, the more intense the emotional reaction becomes. Physically, the body starts to respond as if it's in danger. The heart rate increases, the stomach tightens, sleep becomes restless, appetite changes. The brain releases stress hormones like cortisol, keeping the body in a heightened state of awareness. This is because the brain doesn't distinguish between physical threats and emotional threats. To the nervous system, being abandoned or ignored can feel just as dangerous as being chased by a predator. Uncertainty forces the mind into a loop of overanalyzing everything that happened before the silence. Every past conversation gets replayed. Every detail is scrutinized. Maybe I shouldn't have said that. Did I come across the wrong way? Did they misunderstand me? It becomes an obsession, an emotional roller coaster with no brakes. One moment, there's hope. Maybe they're just having a busy day. The next, there's despair. Maybe I was never important to them in the first place. The mind flips between best case and worst case scenarios, exhausting itself in the process. What makes uncertainty so painful is that it removes the ability to act with confidence. If someone knew for sure that they had done something wrong, they could apologize. If they knew for sure that the other person was just busy, they could relax. But uncertainty? It leaves them paralyzed. It steals their ability to move forward because they don't know which direction to take. Do they reach out again? Would that make them seem needy? Do they wait? Would that make them seem uninterested? Do they ask directly? What if that pushes the other person away? Every possible action feels like the wrong one, so they do nothing and suffer in silence. But even silence isn't truly silent, because in that silence, the mind keeps running, keeps searching, keeps creating meaning where there is none. It fills in the blanks with fears and insecurities. And because emotions are stronger than logic, those fears start to feel like reality. The worst part? The person who went silent may not even realize the chaos they've created. To them, it may be nothing, a break from talking, a moment of distraction, a need for space. They aren't feeling the uncertainty. They aren't living in the emotional storm they've unknowingly caused. But the one left in the dark, their mind is at war with itself. Logic tells them not to overthink, but emotions refuse to stay quiet. They try to distract themselves, but the thoughts keep creeping back in. They may even tell themselves they don't care, but deep down they do, because uncertainty has made it impossible not to. And that's the real cost of silence. It doesn't just create distance. It creates a battlefield in the mind of the one left wondering. A war between hope and fear, logic and emotion, action and hesitation. A war they never asked to fight, but one they can't escape. In the face of uncertainty, the easiest thing to do is nothing, to wait. To sit in silence and hope that the answers will come on their own. But here's the hard truth, they rarely do. Silence is not clarity. It is not closure. It is a breeding ground for misunderstanding, insecurity, and emotional chaos. And when left unchecked, it doesn't just create distance, it destroys relationships. That's why action is the only antidote. The mind, when left alone in uncertainty, will always default to assumptions. It will take the missing pieces and fill them in with the worst case scenario, not because it wants to, but because it has to. The brain needs to make sense of things, and when it has no facts, it relies on fear, doubt, and past experiences to create its own version of reality. Imagine someone waiting for a response from a person they care about. Hours pass, then days, then a week. At first they might think, maybe they're just busy. But then silence stretches on. The initial thought of busyness turns into, maybe they don't want to talk to me anymore. Then it turns into, maybe I did something wrong. Then maybe I was never as important to them as they were to me. And just like that, silence has rewritten the relationship. Without a single word spoken, the mind has decided the meaning behind the absence of communication. But here's what people don't realize. Most assumptions are wrong. They are based on emotion, not truth, on insecurity, not fact, on fear, not reality. How many times have people assumed someone was ignoring them, only to later find out they were dealing with something personal? How many times have people thought they weren't important, only to later realize the other person was struggling with their own battles? How many relationships have ended not because of actual conflict, but because one person assumed the worst and chose to walk away without ever finding out the truth? That's the cost of assumption. But action? Action eliminates the unknown. It replaces assumptions with answers. It brings clarity to confusion. Action is sending the message instead of wondering if you should. Action is picking up the phone instead of waiting for the other person to do it first. Action is asking the question instead of letting your mind create its own answers. Action is having the uncomfortable conversation instead of avoiding it and hoping it fixes itself. Because here's the thing, silence is easy. Ignoring a problem is easy. Walking away instead of communicating is easy, but easy is rarely what builds strong connections. Action is uncomfortable, it requires vulnerability, it forces people to face the possibility of hearing something they may not want to hear. But it also does something even more powerful, it prevents unnecessary loss. How many friendships could have been saved if someone had simply said, "Hey, I notice we haven't talked much. Is everything okay?" How many relationships could have avoided heartbreak if one person had just asked, "Are we good?" instead of assuming the worst? How many misunderstandings could have been prevented with just a single conversation? The truth is, most people don't intend to hurt others with their silence. They're not trying to make someone overthink, feel insecure, or question their worth. Most of the time, they are dealing with their own struggles, stress, personal battles, mental exhaustion. But when communication stops, intentions no longer matter. Only perception does. And perception is what drives people's actions. If someone believes they are being ignored, they will eventually stop reaching out. If someone believes they are no longer wanted, they will eventually walk away. If someone believes their presence no longer matters, they will eventually learn to live without it. And once they leave, it's rarely because they wanted to, it's because silence convinced them they had no choice. That's why taking action isn't just about finding answers. It's about preventing unnecessary loss. It's about keeping relationships intact instead of letting them fade into nothingness. It's about breaking the cycle of assumption before it turns into reality, because in the end, silence is not the absence of communication. It's a message, and if you don't control what that message says, the other person's mind will do it for you.